Great. Well, I guess I've been asking a bit since I got here, and I guess that there'll be quite a range of experience of prophecy amongst all of us that are gathered here today. So I'm aware that it's something that is, there are folks here for whom it's been around for a long time, been part of their life for a long time. I'm also aware that it's something that is probably growing within this church in terms of engagement with it and understanding of it, and that's fantastic. So what I want to talk about a little bit over this next period of time is how we actually dig in to listening to God a little bit more. How do we really do that better? I think there's a few other things we'll talk about. I think tomorrow we'll think a little bit more about how we make sure that we have the right kind of culture to make sure that it's a safe environment. I mean, I've talked about that a little bit today. There's a few simple things like, integrity, not drama, and, it takes lots of people to weigh something rather than one. Those sorts of things are helpful, aren't they? I think there's other things too, like the way that actually training people the way to deliver a prophecy in a way that's helpful and things like that. So we can look at that stuff, but we'll make sure that we have some Q&A as well, so we can dig into other topics that you want to do. But I just want to think about first of all how we learn to listen to God a little bit better, perhaps, and to go in. And these would be the things that I would talk about to get to know him and his ways better. I think the better that you know somebody, the more likely you are to not misinterpret what they say to you. Have you noticed that? Yeah. Have you ever had those conversations with people where, there's words going between you, but what one person's saying and what the other person is hearing are two completely different things? Yeah. So if that can happen, so I can just see it connecting with people. Yeah. I can think of people. But if that happens with people, how much more who you can actually see and get the body language from, how much more can that happen with the Lord? Yeah. At one level, you'd think it might happen less with the Lord because he's actually in you. But at another level, I think that it really helps to begin to actively know more about the way that God operates, because that then helps us to hear him more clearly. So that would be one thing. We'll talk about that a bit more. Expecting different forms of communication. So, you could have a thing, couldn't you, where you're trying to communicate with your teenage child, your teenage offspring, and they have their headphones in and they're listening to music very loudly, and they're leant over their phone, and they're communicating away merrily, and it's all by text, yeah. And you're standing there trying to talk to them, and they can't hear a word you're saying, yeah. Why is that? Because you're trying to communicate in one way, and they're engaging with communication in a completely different way, yeah. And sometimes I think God chooses to communicate in a way that we can hear. I think that's right. He's the dad. He does that. But also I think sometimes he communicates in the way that he chooses, and I think he does that on purpose because he wants to teach us. He sometimes wants us to come after him and learn to communicate his way. Yeah, and I think it's both. We do both. So learning to perhaps think outside the box a bit in terms of how might God communicate with you, and we'll dig into that a little bit more. And then a really big one, whether we'll get onto this today or tomorrow, I don't know, but this is a really big one for me, is learning to filter out false voices. So when we talk about kind of psychosis and mental illness, what tends to happen, I've got a friend who's in the UK, he's a really eminent psychiatrist, and he's talked to me about these things a lot. And what he basically was saying to me was that all of us kind of operate on a spectrum, and actually if you're like schizophrenic or something like that, and you're hearing voices, actually what's going on from a psychiatric point of view, he was saying, is no different from what happens to everybody, except it's kind of more crystallized, more clear. Yeah, so you're actually hearing them as real voices inside your head. But actually, you back that down the spectrum a little bit, and it's very rare to have someone who doesn't have any voices. It's just you might not be hearing them in your head, but they're still there in your heart. They're still, if you've been told since you were a kid that you're never going to amount to anything, you might not be hearing a voice saying you'll never amount to anything, but there's a voice there, isn't there, that makes it that makes it difficult to really achieve, if that was the thing. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that part of hearing God is learning to stop hearing all the other stuff that crowds out God's voices. Yeah? God's wanting to talk to you, but for many of us, his voice is one, he uses the still small voice, and it's one voice amongst a dozen voices in our hearts and heads, and we're spending too much time listening to the other stuff. So that's a really good thing for us to dig into, and it might be that there's some ministry that we do about that at some point as well, is actually beginning to identify some of those and actually saying, no, I'm not going to listen to those anymore. And then the last one, I think, is be ready to respond to what you hear. And there's a great African pastor, a Ugandan, called John Malundi. And John Malundi came and spoke to us in the UK. And he's really been used in the Ugandan revival. He's a towering kind of statesman of the Ugandan church, and he's just been powerfully used by God. And he sometimes has sat and had been invited for dinner with the president, you know. And yet, when you hear his story, he'd done this church planting, he'd got all these plant churches, and then God told him to leave them all and go and just serve in someone else's ministry. And he served for very little money. And, you know, he said at the time, when he was the church leader of all these churches he'd planted, everybody called him Daddy, which is often the culture in some of the African nations. And then suddenly he gave all that up because God told him to. He's working for this other organisation. Everybody's calling him Boy, you know. And it was just really hard. And he did it because God told him to. And actually, 10 years from when he was working for that ministry and all he was being paid was a cup of tea and a slice of toast, 10 years later he was sitting having dinner with the president, having seen a massive revival happen. You know, and so when someone like that comes to speak, you want to hear them, don't you? It's like, okay, what do you want to say to us in the West? And it was really interesting. What he said was this. He said, I think the two biggest problems in the Western culture, and I was thinking, oh, he's going to say consumerism, and he's going to say, you know, and he didn't. He said distraction and procrastination. Yeah, he said there's all these godly Christians, and they want to do what God says, and they start doing it, and then all the enemy has to do is distract them, and they just follow. They just go and get distracted. And then God tells them to do something, and they hear it, and they think, oh yeah, I'll do that at some point. And they put it, our expression in the UK, I don't know if you have this, is they put it on the back burner. Yeah, and we put it on the back burner. That's like, do you have that expression? Okay, so you put it on the back burner, and before you know it, you know, 3, 4, 5 years has gone past, and you still haven't done it. Yeah? And maybe by that time, actually, the voice has got a bit quieter as well, because you're not really listening to it anymore. And one of the things that we've really learned as we've pursued hearing God's voice and the pursuit of the prophetic, but not really just the prophetic ministry, just everyday Christianity, which believes that Christians can hear God. As we pursued that, what we found is this. If we hold each other accountable that we actually do what God says, then he tells you what to do next. Oh, shock horror. Yeah? And it's weird. If you set up a culture, I mean, do any of you know about huddles? Have you heard about this huddle thing? Yeah. So huddle is something that we use all the time, and basically we use it for any of the leaders of any of our groups. And you just sit in a circle, and we've got these tools to help people to do it. But basically, you ask the question, you go round, and you basically ask the question, what is God saying to you now? What's God saying right now? Yeah. Now, you don't just say it like that, because people would look at you like you were mad and say, I don't know, that's the $1,000,000 question. What is God saying? But we do is we take people through a process where we teach them to listen. Yeah. And we use these questions and things to trigger responses. And what's the still small voice? What's the conviction of the Holy Spirit? So basically we do this, and our guys will do this every 2 weeks. Yeah. So you sit around together, everybody says, this is what I think God's saying, and then you all reflect on it together and make some observations and think about it and discuss it and all that. And then, like 20 minutes before the end of that get-together, you go around again and you say, now what's the plan? What are you going to do about what you heard? Yeah? And the weird thing is, 2 weeks later, that group's all going to hold you accountable. Did you do what you said you were going to do? Yeah? Can you imagine? It's like you're like a worm on the hook. You know, you're squirming to get away. It's really hard because basically, if you make the mistake of telling people what you think God's telling you to do, you've got the whole group on your back from then on that they're going to, have you done it yet? Well, why haven't you done it? Well, because it's really hard. yeah, but whoever said the gospel's easy? When are you going to do it? You know, it's like, oh, why did I ever say that? So, but what we found is that when people join in with those groups and do that, the testimony of people who stay with it is this: my spiritual life is moving so fast right now compared to what it used to be. I feel like I'm growing so fast. And do you know why? Because if you do what God says, then he tells you what to do next. Yeah, rather than him telling you what to do and then you just chewing on it for like 5 years. Yeah? So I think that's a really big one, is about being ready to respond to what it is that you hear. I first had my first prophetic experience, I believe, when I first came back to the Lord at 18, and I was in this Baptist church that had a little bit of renewal going on. They did believe in those things. There wasn't a huge amount of it being practiced, but they did. There were one or two people who did that stuff, and people recognised that it was probably real. And I was sitting at the front of church, and suddenly this stuff came into my head for somebody, and I thought, I think that's from God. I didn't really have language for it at this point. I think that might be from God, and I think that's for that person. And I thought at the time, you've got to be absolutely kidding. There is no way on this earth that I'm going to go over to somebody else and say, I think God's saying this. It's just, it's just not going to happen. And then I went off to university, and I didn't have another experience like that for about 3 or 4 years. It just didn't happen again. And why would it? I mean, what was the point of God giving me stuff? I wasn't going to say it anyway. Yeah? And then I went through all that stuff I told you about earlier. And once I went through all that, something that happened once I started to believe God did talk was one day when I was just praying, or I think I was just out walking and just thinking about the Lord, and I suddenly remembered that. And now I believe that God spoke, and I felt like the Lord was challenging me and saying, now that you believe that I actually talk, Paul, that's a really good point in a relationship. Yeah? Now you actually believe I might want to talk with you. Here's the thing. If I do talk to you, are you going to do anything about it? Because 3 or 4 years ago, I talked to you and you said no. Is the answer still no? And at that point, I said to the Lord, I was really cut to my heart, actually. I was really convicted. And I said, okay, Lord, this is the thing. And honestly, I've got to be honest with you, I haven't completely kept this. I haven't been always faithful to it. But I've done it most times. I said, if I really believe that you're saying something to me, I will always say it now, even if it's wrong. Yeah? And I felt, I mean, you weigh this, whether this is from the Lord or not, I don't know. This is now the thought that went through my head. So was it me? Was it God? Who knows? You judge. This is the thought that went through my head after I said that in my heart. This is the difference between a half-hearted man and a wholehearted man, Paul. This is the thought that went through my head. A half-hearted man says, I don't know if it's God, so I'm not going to do it. A wholehearted man says, I don't know if it's God, but I can't risk missing it if it is. I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah? So I think that was from the Lord. I mean, I've just described exactly what happened. It's just a thought that went through my head, but I think that was from the Lord. And so I'm thinking, well, I want to be wholehearted, Lord. So the problem with it is, the downside is sometimes I look stupid. I mean, I say stuff, it wasn't from the Lord. You don't say it in a controlling way or an abusive way, so it doesn't harm anybody. It just makes you look stupid. Hey, I mean, let's not let that stop us from engaging with the power of God. Yeah? So be ready to respond to what you hear. So let's just think about getting to know God and his ways. And firstly, I'd say, and I'm sure that you guys know this stuff, but firstly, I would say the Bible is the backdrop to this for me, because it's like the phrase book of heaven. The Bible is what God has chosen to inspire people to write over hundreds and hundreds of years. And what I've found is that the better I know it, the more acquainted I am with it, the easier it is to operate prophetically. I don't know why. You might not find the same. I think you probably will. But I think there's something really important about that. So engaging with the Bible regularly. So if at the moment you don't read the Bible much, and there's lots of reasons why you might not. For example, if you grew up in a really legalistic kind of church that equated reading the Bible to walking with God, which obviously is not the same thing, the church I grew up in, the Bible is practically one of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Scripture. And, so I mean, that might be, if that's the case for you, then it actually might have been really healthy since you came to know God, to actually step away from some systematic reading of the Bible for a while. Now, it might have been something God led you to do, I don't know. You know, but what I would say is that finding a way to engage with the Word of God regularly, I think if you're wanting to become more prophetic, is just a really helpful thing, because you're just filling your mind with the phrase book. You know, I mean, I'm not trying to reduce the Bible down there. It's way more than that, but it's just really helpful. So that's why I put that at the back. And then we tend to think in our church in terms of up in and out. I don't know whether you've probably heard, if you've heard Mike Breen, you've probably heard him say that. Our guys have death by triangles in our church. We use them all the time. And the reason is, and I tell you what, do you guys have James Blunt, the singer? Yeah? Do you remember he did that song Beautiful? I don't know whether you ever saw the Sesame Street version, but it's called Triangle. Yes. He did a triangle, and because of our church, they use this all the time. It just was like wildfire around our church. Everyone was doing the James Blunt Triangle song. So, but the reason we do it is because it's basically the essence of the gospel is the great commandment and the great commission. Yeah? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind, up. Love your neighbour as yourself, in. That's the great commandment. And the great commission, go and make disciples, out. And we just use that as a tool to remind ourselves that that's what it's all about. And the reason we do it is because our observation is we almost all of us naturally do 2 out of the 3. Yeah, so I don't know what your 2 would be. But, you know, if you were going to give yourself a traffic light rating on each of those, would it be green, amber, or red? You know, what would it be for... If you're green on all 3, then you are a special person. Either that or you're out of touch with reality. Yeah? So we use that all the time just to remind ourselves that we need to keep a balance in those 3 dimensions of life. And if we're going to do a kind of up and out of getting to know God and his ways, I would put holiness at the top. And that might be an emotive word for you, again, depending on your background. And that, in America particularly, what I've noticed is that holiness and the kind of holiness teaching churches and so on seems to be about prohibition. I don't mean alcohol, I mean of everything. Yeah, so it's almost like holiness is about what you don't do. Yeah, what I'd say is I think that's a fundamentally unbiblical understanding of holiness. Holiness is not about being empty, it's about being full. Yeah? Yeah? If you don't do bad stuff because you're holy, yeah, that's not the same thing as if you don't do bad stuff because you're being good, yeah, because you're trying hard to be good. One of the 2, the first one is easy and full of joy. The second one's really hard, and you're probably going to fall off that any time. Yeah. So. Holiness is basically about the pursuit of God, isn't it? And allowing God to pursue you. It's about dealing with the stuff in your heart, and you know where you might have a really bad idea of what father is like because of your own father, and you've got to learn that God, your father, is not like that. It might be something like that. It might be that you've been rejected really badly, and you have to learn that God doesn't reject you. He really loves you. In fact, I think God doesn't just love you, but he's in love with you. You know, it's like, I don't know whether you've ever experienced, have you ever experienced it where you're in love with somebody, but they don't know? Or maybe when you were younger, you might have had this, or somebody, you know, some of you might have this now. It's like, if that's the case, you might be acting all kind of nonchalant and just acting like you'd, but if that person walked into the room, you'd be totally aware of that from the second they walked into the room, wouldn't you? Yeah? I think God's like that about you. Yeah, it's not just that he loves you, he's totally in love with you. I mean, he gave his son for you. I mean, he's got to like you a bit, yeah? So there's that stuff going on, isn't it, holiness. There's the stuff, I think there is stuff to do with spiritual disciplines. But again, that language probably isn't very helpful because discipline sounds like, you know, I mean, there is a thing about it, but it sounds a bad thing. The spiritual disciplines is basically just learning to do stuff that helps you to connect with the Holy Spirit who lives in you. Yeah? So, for example, in a normal, from what I can see, this might be wrong, you guys know your own culture, I don't know the American culture nearly as well as you do, but I think one of the issues in American churches is it seems like people aren't taught very many spiritual disciplines, and almost like one of the only spiritual disciplines people are taught is how to engage with the presence of God in the context of communal worship altogether. Yeah? So we've learned how to gather with a whole load of other people, have a great band, have the words projected up. And then as you grow more mature, you learn to actually, in that context, you've taught yourself to put down your concerns, to put down your worries, to put down the distractions, and you use the words at the front to focus on Jesus and just to focus on Jesus. And you actually, as you become a more mature worshipper, you learn to do that, don't you? And as you learn to do that, what sometimes happens is you have a greater sense of the presence of Jesus. Not surprising, because you're learning to focus on him, yeah? And he's living in you by his Holy Spirit. And if you really learn to do that and really focus on him and you engage with him, and there might even be times in the middle of that where you have a little time of profound joy or of revelation or whatever. And that's great. But what I'd say is that's just one spiritual discipline amongst tons of available spiritual disciplines. There's disciplines of abstinence and disciplines of fun and disciplines of fasting and feasting and disciplines of doing stuff and disciplines of not doing stuff. And I mean, make up your own discipline. I mean, whatever. But it's learning to do the stuff that helps you to engage with God is part of the journey of holiness, I think. Yeah? So I think that can often be very personality dependent. So I'm quite introverted, and I'm in a very extroverted job, being a church leader. And one of the things I find is we have rhythms of prayer in our church. Like we'll ring a little bell. We ring a bell for two reasons in our church. We ring a bell in our offices if someone has got saved and there's a story and everyone gathers and hears the story. But also we ring the bell at certain times of the day, and we just gather literally for 5 minutes, just in the busyness to remember Jesus. And we just we'll say a little prayer, we'll read a bit of scripture, and then we will go off and we'll say, does anyone need anything praying for? Pray for them, and then go off again. But what I've noticed is that is a brilliant model for extroverts. Like for me, it takes me 20 minutes just to clear everything out of my head so I can start to think about God, yeah? So for me, I actually have to have I don't need it as often, but I need longer. Yeah, and that's really important for me. So I have to order my day so I have some periods of time that are a bit longer so I can dial everything down, get rid of all the stuff that's in my head and actually focus back on the Lord. I've also found for me it's really important early in the day, before too much stuff has built up, rather than at the end of the day. But equally that has been a model. The introvert's model has been a model that people have been given in evangelical churches for years. It's like, you should have a quiet time every morning. Well, it might be that that's a good discipline for you. It might be that's a totally useless discipline for you and you need to find a different discipline. Yeah? Yeah? It's great, isn't it? And I think there's a difference between saying, I don't want to take any disciplines, I'm not going to be bothered to put anything into trying to learn more about God, and that's on the one hand. I mean, that would just be silly, wouldn't it? Because it'd be like, well, I mean, God will still love you anyway, but you're going to miss out on some stuff. But on the other hand, there is a different thing, which is, here are other people's disciplines that they've said are really important to them. That doesn't necessarily mean they're yours. What is it that you need to do? So holiness, the pursuit of God. Another really big one is community. I think it's weird because America is an extroverted culture, but a lot of the teaching on engaging with God is introverted teaching. So it's weird. It's like the picture of the godly person is this person doing a quiet time on their own, away from everybody else, which is completely at odds with almost like the whole of the rest of your culture. I don't know why that is. It's a weird thing. And it might be that's a good thing, but I think that the discipline of community is really important. I think it's really, really difficult to learn more about God and his ways on your own. And I think that from experience, but I also think that because think about what Jesus did to teach the disciples about God. I mean, they spent almost all their time together in community. They lived in community, they ate in community, they faced difficulty, they had fun, they got tired, but basically they hung out together a lot. Yeah? Now, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't ever be alone. I mean, Jesus got up early in the morning and went off to be on his own, didn't he? I mean, that's there in the Gospels. But when I say community, I don't mean programmatic meetings. They're not the same thing. Yeah? Because I think we're really good at substitutes in the West. Right? We substitute like sweetener for sugar because it tastes nearly as good but doesn't have the calories or whatever. Yeah? We substitute programs for community because programs are bite-sized and we can get hold of them, we can say when they're going to be and what they're going to do. And we can do a program without losing our whole life. Whereas community, it's like this amorphous thing that could take over everything. Oh no. Yeah? So I think there's something about community. And we would tell our folks in our church that you don't, programs are good, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not the fundamental building block. The fundamental building block of community, we would say, is shared rhythms of food and prayer. Shared rhythms, not just meetings. And we try to get our guys to try to get a more integrated lifestyle where actually they can drop in and out of each other's homes, and they do share meals together regularly, and they're praying together regularly. I personally think it's really important for getting to know God better. I mean, John says, doesn't he, if you don't love, is it James, if you don't love your brother who you do see, how can you love God who you don't see? Yeah? So I think there's a challenge to us in our culture there, because I think what we do is, our culture is an overwork culture, and I mean the Brits as well as America. I think America's even more than Britain. It's an overwork culture, which means when you're not working, you're exhausted. And so then you have this defensive thing, which means now I need to be on my own and I need to be in control of my environment. Yeah? And the problem is, where does God get in? Where does God get into that? Yeah, so I think that's an important one. And then the third one just comes back to that same stuff we're talking about actually doing it. It's active faith. Philemon says, doesn't it, I pray that you be active in sharing your faith so that you may know the fullness of the gospel. There's the thing, unless you're active in stepping out in faith, what's the faith journey you're on right now? What faith journey are you on right now? Yeah, I'm really proud of my wife, and I tell stories about her. I'm going to give you guys a break in a minute, okay, but I'll just tell you this story. Because she's just so hardcore when it comes to Christianity. And about the time where I was trying to work out whether I believed that God listened to, whether God spoke to me or not, she was smuggling Bibles into Russia. And she just loves all that stuff. And she worked with Campus Crusade for Christ, which in Europe is called Agape. I don't know whether they've changed that in the US now, but it's the same organisation. And they would just go on on vacation to Russia, and they'd take a big suitcase with a few bit clothes on the top and just Bibles, and then they'd go in, and you had to go with the guides that would take you around Moscow, and then you duck off the back and you go running off, and you go and find people who are drawn to you because you're wearing Western clothes, and start giving them Bibles and telling them about Jesus, and then you go back. Then you say to them, right, we're going to come back this time next year, so we'll meet you here. And they'd meet the same people, would come back a year later, and they'd do a bit more, and it's brilliant. And she learnt Russian when she was at university. She was a music major, but she learnt Russian as well. That's how keen she was. And she had agreed to go with the team. She was going to become a full-time missionary in Russia. And then at the last moment, she heard the Lord much more clearly at this stage than I did. At the last moment, she lost all her peace about it, and she felt God was saying, don't go to Russia. And she was like, well, what do I do? And she'd learned to be a teacher, because that was how she was, being a music teacher was how she was going to get in to Russia. And so she felt God said, go back to Sheffield. She'd left Sheffield at this point, and you need to apply for this teaching job. And she applied for it, and there were a whole load of applicants, I think about 50 applicants. She got the job. She knew that God had called her back to Sheffield. We had only met once at this point, very, very briefly, in a Bible study. We didn't know each other. And I was going steady with another girl at that time, and so there was nothing between us at all. I was a worship leader at the church by that time, and then the other worship leader finished their ministry. They felt it was time to step back from that. It was a voluntary ministry in those days. And in those days, if you stepped back, it was your job to say who you thought needed to step up into it. And she said, I think it's... so I was one worship leader. This was the other worship leader. She said, I think it's Ellie. And we were all like, Ellie doesn't go to this church anymore. She's left. She lives in Oxford. And she's like, I know, but I've really prayed about it, and I think the Lord's been really clear that it's Ellie. And we were like, not really sure what we do with that. I mean, that's great and everything. And then like a day later, Ellie turns up back at the church. So she went straight into the worship leader job opposite me. And we, as she came back to Sheffield, she heard God speak to her. And he said this, you're going to marry Paul Maconochie. Well, now what do you do with that? How do you make that not an abusive word, eh? Well, what she did was she just didn't say anything. She didn't tell me. She didn't tell anybody. She just kept it to herself, which I think is absolutely the godly thing to do in that case, isn't it? I mean, you really can't go to somebody and say, God said to me, you're going to marry me. I mean, actually, that's probably the best way to make sure they never do, isn't it? So yeah. But so she just kept it to herself. And then we got to know each other, and that relationship I was talking about before had finished before then, and we got to know each other, and we started to go out, and actually I was absolutely certain, and actually God spoke to me as well. This is really unhelpful in our church if young adults ask us about dating and stuff, because our story is just not one that is helpful, but it is our story. And I said to God, we'd gone out on one date, and that night when I went to bed, I said to God, what's the deal here, God? Because I was 25 then. I said, I don't want to get into another relationship that's not, if it's not serious, and just tell me what this is about. I really cared about her. And I got a scripture in my head, a reference. I didn't know what it was. I looked it up, a single scripture. I looked it up, it said, I shall pour out my spirit on your offspring. I was like, whoa, this is first date. So I'm like, okay. Ooh. But actually I proposed to her after 9 weeks, and we got married in 6 months, and that was 17 years ago, so that's all right, isn't it? But here we were, so we were down the line, okay, she's this radical missionary woman, yeah, and she got married to me, and then I became the leader of the church. After Mike Breen left, I became the leader of the church, and for the first time in our lives, we're being paid a really good salary. We're in a nice suburban home. We had young children. She wasn't working at that point. And I was out, and just, it was in the afternoon, I was out working. And she stood in one of the bedrooms and looked out at the backyard and thought, oh, do you know, the grass really needs cutting. I need to cut the grass. And then she noticed our neighbour next door, lovely man, not a Christian, but a lovely man, and he was out cutting his lawn. And she suddenly thought to herself, I'm no different from him. I'm supposed to be following Jesus. What am I doing? I'm just living in comfortable suburbia. And she could feel it getting its claws into her, like the consumerist safety and security, safety and security, comfort and convenience, that kind of heady mix that together becomes an enemy of the gospel if you let it take hold. None of those things are wrong in themselves, are they? Safety, security, comfort, convenience. They're all okay, but if you have the four of them as a cocktail every day, it's really going to take the edge off your faith, isn't it? Yeah? And it's where being active in faith is really important for getting to know God's ways, I think. It's really hard to know God if you don't go on a faith journey. And I came back from work, and she said to me, Paul, I used to be a missionary, and now look at me, I'm not happy. I don't think it's right. We're supposed to be missionaries. The fact we're supposed to be missionaries to Sheffield doesn't mean we're not missionaries. But I don't know if I can be a missionary living like this. What do we do? And I said, I get what you're saying. And she said, this is what I think we should do. If we'd gone to that place in Russia, we wouldn't have had any money, and we would have lived with the other missionaries, probably in a single house to start with, until we got set up. She said, I think we should get some friends from the church. We should move in with them, live in community for a year, and I think we should give all our money away. Let me just say that again. All our money away. And live by faith, and just see what God does. Yeah. So after I picked my drawer up off the floor, I kind of thought about it, and I just thought it brought a crisis up for me, really, because it's like kind of poker, she's calling me, and there's an element to which I've been bluffing. Do you know what I mean? So I'm thinking, okay, she really wants to be a Christian. I'm just a church leader. She really wants to be a Christian, and in the end, we talked about it, prayed about it, and we thought, we don't think God's telling us to do this. We don't think God's asked us to do this. She just wants to do this. And I thought, okay, let's do this. Let's see what happens. Because I thought, Jesus said you don't have to worry about those things. Yeah? Either that's true, or why are we Christians? And if it's not true, if it is true, then we never need to worry again. That's really good news, isn't it? If it isn't true, why are we believing something that's not true? Yeah? And it really kind of closed in on me. And so we went on that faith journey. So we asked some friends, and they said yes, and we had another family, a couple with one child. We had 2 young children, and then 2 other single adults who were friends of ours, and we all moved in, and it was a church-owned house at that point. We bought that house since from the church, but at the time, so we didn't have a mortgage, so that was a big benefit for us. But we gave all our money away. We didn't have any money for anything else. And one of the people who moved in had a business, the guy, and he had £6,000 of business debt. His business was in trouble. And yet we did it. And what we felt was we shouldn't just force this on our kids. This is a bit extreme. So they've got to own it. Because I'm really aware that, particularly with church kids, it's like you always just have to do what your parents do. And they're doing it, if they're doing it like because they're leading the church, I mean, that's just not healthy, is it? So Hannah was a bit too young, but Grace, our oldest, was about 6, 7. And so we sat her down by on the kitchen table, and we just said, look, Grace, we just feel like this is an adventure. We feel like Jesus said this. He said, you don't have to worry. We feel like we should give all our money away for a while and just trust God and just see what happens and move into community with some other guys. And because we feel like we don't know God well enough to do what he's calling us to do, and we're not living as if we do. And so we want to do that. But if you really think that this isn't from God, and one of the things we've really been trying to teach our kids as they're grown up, I mean, they're now 14 and 11, we've really been trying to teach them the difference between, is God saying this, and do I like this? Yeah? So we'll often say if we're doing another faith adventure, let's not ask the question whether we're happy about it or not, but we're really interested in whether you think God's saying it or not, because if you think God isn't saying it, we take that seriously. Yeah? Because there's stuff in the Bible about children and young people and the kingdom of God. So we said to her, what do you think? And I tell you what, it was one of the most moving times of my parenthood. She said, wait there, Mum and Dad. And she went upstairs, and then she came down, and she had her purse with her allowance in it, and she gave it to us, and she said, I think we should do it. I mean, we're like, oh, you know. It's cool, isn't it? Yeah? So we did it. So those guys moved in, and we had 6 months where we gave all our money away. All of it. We didn't tell the church, because the church are kind, and they would have paid us a second time through the letterbox, you know. So we didn't tell the church. We told one or two, small number of people that we directly discipled, because we wanted them to go on the journey too. Actually, they ended up being my senior team, a lot of them. And so we had this time without any money. And it's weird, you know. You can't quite work out how it works. Sometimes it worked well and it was easy. Sometimes it was hard. We didn't miss a single bill, and we didn't miss a single meal. Some of the meals weren't what we chose. Some of it was very inconvenient. Sometimes we didn't have gas for the car when we needed to get somewhere, and we had to walk, which in England is possible. It might be different if you do stuff in America. I don't know what God would do. But we went through this process, and it was a hard process, and it's easy to tell it now. You know, stories of faith are always easy with the benefit of hindsight, aren't they? Yeah? What I'd say at the time was we were absolutely terrified. And the fact that we did it in community with others made it possible. If it had just been Ellie and me, we couldn't have done it. But the fact that when we had no money, we gathered around with all 9 of us, you know, and we all prayed together, and we're all praying that bill in, that made it possible. Yeah, because we were all in it together. And we had some amazing things happen. And for example, I'll just give you one example. I had the clutch went on our car, and the cars in the UK are all stick shift, so they have all this complicated clutch thing, and it went. This thing went, and it was going to cost £350. The car had gone in to the garage. I didn't have any money. I had no money. We had 20 pence, 20p. Was all we had between 9 of us, and it was a £350 bill, and I had to go and collect it. Yeah, I mean that will make you sweat, won't it? And there was someone who was staying with us who didn't know what we were doing, and he said, "Oh, I'll take you down in the car because you know your car's down at the garage. I'll take you down." I said, "Oh, look, thanks." So then I'm sitting in the car. The garage is 5 minutes drive away. I've got no money. I mean, I tell you what, these journeys of faith, they do make you pray, don't they? Yeah. So I'm really praying, and then the guy stopped before he drove off, and he stopped like that, hands on the wheel. He looked at me, and he said, "Do you know, I don't know what you think about this, but if it's okay, I want to get this for you." And I said, "This is a really expensive, but it's going to cost $350. What's that, $500? This is going to cost $500. You know, are you sure?" He said, "Well," he said, "we gave some money to this charity for a particular purpose last week, and they sent it back because they'd raised all the money they needed, and because we'd given it for that purpose, they couldn't use it for that. And we felt like that's God's money, not our money, and we've been saying, what should we give it to? And I think we should give it to you." So I got in the car with no money, and by the time we picked it up, I had the money, yeah? It's amazing, isn't it? Now, that was one story amongst lots of stories, yeah? And what we did was, and at the time, the church was struggling financially a bit. We weren't getting enough money in. And we went on this journey, and we started in the summer, and basically we carried on. And around Christmas time, we felt God was saying to us, "I want you to do Christmas with no money. And then after Christmas, you can stop, and then you can reflect on that little journey." So we did Christmas with no money, and we got various bits of money and managed to buy gifts for our family. And then everybody else was going home to their parents, but we couldn't because I'm the pastor of the church, and I lead Christmas Day service. So we didn't have any Christmas dinner. And I mean, you know, we don't have Thanksgiving like you guys. I mean, Christmas is the big turkey dinner, yeah, and of the year. And we didn't have it. We didn't have any money for it. I'm thinking this is going to be a really great Christmas, you know. And 2 days before Christmas, someone rang me up and said, "Have you bought your Christmas food yet?" And I said, "No, I haven't actually." And they went, "That's fantastic because God's told us to buy you all your Christmas food for the whole Christmas week." Yeah, and there's this store in the UK called Marks and Spencer's that does really good quality food, really nice food, and they bought it all from there. It was fantastic, and so it was an amazing experience. And we went on this journey of active faith. Now, I'm not saying that that's the journey for you. You know, it's different journeys for all of us. That was a big journey for us. I'm telling you, you know, you have when you're standing up on a platform, you tell some of your big stories, don't you? There'd be lots of little stories. It might be it's a big journey for you. It might be it's a little journey. You know, it doesn't matter what it is. But honestly, I know God better. And because I know God better, I can hear him more clearly. Does that make sense? And by the way, with that, then what I did was, with our financial problems with the church, from February, I did a 7-week series on faith and generosity. And basically, I just told the church all of the stories from the last 6 months. Yeah, I just told them. And at the end, I challenged them to live a life of faith. And the following month, giving went up by 90%. It went up by 90%. Yeah, and it didn't stay up. It stayed really up there, and then it kind of gradually tailed down. But even when it leveled, it was 25% up on what it was, you know, several months later on what it was before. And that was great for me because it wasn't that people were giving more. It was because they liked me or whatever. It's because they believed more. Yeah, faith had gone up, hadn't it? And I think there are all sorts of other little faith journeys going on there for people. So it's really important that we pursue God, that we do it in community, but also that we have active faith. Are you going on faith journeys? The people of Israel, you know, were told by God, when he set up Israel, this is what he told them to do. Every 7th year, don't plant any food. This is subsistence farming. Every 7th year, don't plant anything. Just trust me and I'll give you everything that you need. Yeah? And every 50th year, if you bought any land, give them their land back. I mean, it's just nuts, isn't it? I mean, how can you run an economy that way? Yeah? And they never, ever did it. They never once did it. And do you know what happened? The generation that saw God do great things stayed faithful, and then the next generation started to fall away, and then the next generation started to fall away more, and before you know it, they're worshipping idols. Yeah? And they're saying, well, you know, those things that were told to us, they're just stories. And honestly, I think that if the people of Israel had done that one thing that God said, and actually everybody went on a faith journey regularly, like he told them to, I think they would have, because then he would have been their God, not just their parents' God. Yeah? So I'm not suggesting you live without any money every 7 years. That's Old Testament. I'm saying, what's the faith journey? Yeah? Let's take a little break, shall we? And I'm going to do one more little thing, and then we'll have some time for ministry. But shall we take like a 10-minute break to be able to just a comfort break, and you might want to get some coffee and just let's just stay in it though. Let's just talk to each other about faith journeys while we're doing that. So we'll come back at 3:45, and we'll probably do another half an hour or so and then finish. But be released if you want to be as well.